Hello everyone, Master Xeon1001 here, and in this video we'll be going over the release updates for Boxcutter 718.5. This one is a bit of an interim release preparing us for future concepts and ideas that should be showing up in the actual very next version of Boxcutter. So this one is actually our true send-off finale for the infinite grid in its current form, and the next time you see it, it'll actually have an entirely new form, which is something I'm quite excited about. Our goal is always optimizations and speed ups and ensuring that users have the best system available at their disposal when it comes to performing the operations that are needed. And without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into this and begin talking about what's new in Boxcutter 718.5. So with the new update of Blender 3.0, that means there's occasion enough for us to perform an update. 3.0 of course is a development build, so that means it'll be a little bit less than stable at this time, but if we load it open, we see that it loads open as if we've never opened Blender before. So we'll choose left click, search, save new settings, and from here we'll click on preferences, and we'll go from here to add-ons, and we'll locate first Boxcutter, and we'll install 718.5. And while we're in here, let's also install HardOps. And we have HardOps enabled 987.9. And with that, we could just press Shift H and Alt V to jump to EVHQ. And let's of course set the tool to Boxcutter and save our default scene. And with that, we are ready to begin. And that's really all there is when it comes to setting up HardOps and Boxcutter for the latest Blender 3.0. This also goes without saying that in the event that you wanted to bring your settings over to Blender 3.0 without messing up your preferences like you see me doing here, there are alternative ways to do that. So here I am looking at my roaming Blender Foundation Blender prefs area where generally add-ons are installed, and we're just going to delete the folder that we created for 3.0, and we're just going to right click and pick link source since we're using link shell extension for Windows, and we'll just drop this as a symbolic link, but instead of calling it 2.93 symbolic link, we'll call it 3.0. And let's actually right click the 3.0 folder we just created, and we want to pick the link source as well, and we will just right click and drop that also as a symbolic link, and we'll just double click this, call it 3.00. Because sometimes Blender's using a 3.0 folder and sometimes it's using a 3.00 folder. It's probably going to use a 3.00 folder because it probably makes the most sense compared to its previous versions, but just in case, just like that, I'm able to get my configuration over to the next version of Blender without having to go through a whole bunch of installation rigmarole. So just letting users know that the previous installation methods and also the methods of sharing your installations across Blenders is still valid, is still the way that I'm currently operating. So in this version, I'm using 2.83.13, the latest version of the LTS, but I'm also using Boxcutter 718.3, which is a previous version of Boxcutter. Generally in Boxcutter, you're used to drawing a cut and then the cut going in the direction of the surface normal. For example, we could even select this face and press Alt N in order to flip the normal, and while it's not something visible, we now see that whenever I attempt to extrude, it actually goes the opposite direction. That's because the direction of our extrude is based on the normals that you are drawing from. So anytime you have flipped normals, it's going to cause you issues whenever you're using Boxcutter. However, the same rules that we have for red box simply can't be stated as the way things should be when it comes to green box and gray box, which is Make. So if we press tab, we see that we're able to move dots whichever direction that we want. If we wanted to bring it more in or bring it more out, we're able to do that just by pausing it and grabbing these dots. However, in the event that I were to, say, draw a shape here and I press A to switch to a Make, which is just simply making a box, we see that I'm able to extrude it out this way, but I'm not able to bring it back the other way. And this always seems like a bit of a logic error with Make to me because, despite the rules that we have with our other boxes, Make is something special to me, and I feel that it shouldn't actually play by the same rules that the other shapes do simply because Make is just Make. It doesn't do anything modifier related. So this is where this version ends and the next version begins. So to show it again, if I were to say join, we see that I'm able to join and bring the box out this direction, but I'm not able to bring the box inward. I could bring it in, press tab, grab the dot and attempt to do it. However, we see that this dot only allows us to drag it out this way, and then once we drag this dot out, we're able to grab this dot and begin bringing the shape inward. And this is just a really strange way to have to work. So that brings us to our current version, where if we take a look at the top. It says we're using Boxcutter 718.5, and what that means is that whenever you perform a red cut, it still behaves the same. You're still going to be able to draw it in the direction that you intend to. However, whenever it comes to behavior like join or make, which you can bring up with either A or J, we see that we're now able to bring join both directions, which is a small thing in terms of Boxcutter, but it's definitely going to be a major thing going forward when it comes to giving each of these shapes a different type of behavioral system to make them behave in a way optimal for the results that we're trying to go for. So I'll just turn off grid. We'll work from this point here. Make is also now bi-directional, meaning that you can now drag it inward and outward without any sort of issue. However, I see as I'm messing with it that we also will need to go back and make the numbers also go negative in order to allow View Extrude to be able to handle this sort of development. But just letting you know that we're taking steps towards making join and make bi-directional so users can be able to use it in a variety of different ways that were previously unavailable to them. In previous Boxcutter versions, like you see me using here, we could press D, jump over to Ngon, and let's just begin drawing our shape. And we will just use this last point snapping in order to apply it. And before extruding, we'll just press B in order to perform a nice bevel, and we'll just round it off. And then from here, perform the extrusion. From here, I'm going to shift to keep it live, and this is where things begin to fall apart. So I'm going to draw a box and perform my cut, and so far, so good. However, if I press B and begin performing a bevel, we see that the weight of this new bevel is affecting the weight of the previous bevel. And this is actually due to a sorting issue, and this was something that was driving me crazy for quite a while. However, internally, we finally got it dealt with. So here we see what the situation looks like. In the previous version of Blender, what we need is for this bevel to be underneath the boolean and the boolean to be less, so that way whenever we perform our operations, everything actually works out according to plan. And to show that in action again, we're just going to perform another cut, and you see so far everything is so good except for the cut disappearing with the interior because of doubles. But if we press B, we see that we're also beveling the marked edges that are being used for the bevel of this new shape. So this is failing on multiple levels, but let's just shift this to live and select the shape, and we see that once again all we have to do is just make sure that the bevel is first in the stack before going to all of these booleans, and everything works out according to plan. And so with that is how things are supposed to go. But just letting you know that previously things weren't going like that. In fact, this was something that happened with all of our shapes that utilize weight. I'll draw a box, we'll bevel it, which means that weight is being used to perform the bevel, allowing us to control each individual corner if we needed. But the moment it breaks down is whenever another shape is being brought into the mix that also has a bevel. And as you can see, this is probably a shape that I actually use quite often. So let's just select this shape and let's just push the bevel back up to the top, and we see that everything's working out the way it's supposed to. However, users shouldn't have to go through so much work and think so much in order to perform a simple cutter-on-cutter operation. So let's just perform our cut again using Ngon, just giving it a few angles, last point snapping, right click, we'll press B in order to bevel, just rounding it out till we get the exact bevel that we want. We'll shift it to live, and from here we can just press D, go into box select, press B, press space bar, draw it again, press B, press space bar. I've actually tested this so much that I'm 100% confident that this is no longer going to be an issue for users, because the fix was actually relatively easy. It was just a matter of expressing exactly what the issue was that we aimed to solve with it. So I'm happy to announce that now whenever you're using weights on weights inside of Boxcutter, the sorting will now behave properly, allowing you to get the desired result without any sort of sorting mishaps actually occurring. With every update of Boxcutter, we're aiming to improve repeat and the connection with repeat and the various systems of Boxcutter. So right now I have grid up, and just to show repeat in action, we'll just draw a shape, start it from the center draw, and spacebar to apply it. And now whenever I double click on a grid point, we see that we're able to continuously repeat that shape. However, new to this version, you'll now be able to draw a shape, and if you turn it into a join, just like you're seeing me do there by pressing J, we can now switch our mode over to join. And then whenever we control double click, we're able to now repeat join operations. So this was something that we were previously unable to do in Boxcutter, but now we're able to do, where repeat now supports join, which is just a small oversight, but I'm happy to see that it's finally been rectified. In addition to this, you can of course still use Everscroll to recall your cutters. Like I will choose to recall this cutter, and this cutter. So now both these cutters are back for me to select. I can actually press Shift V, bring up the Boxcutter transform gizmo, and if we hold Shift and drag it, we see that we're able to repeat this operation to wherever we want while still keeping it live. And we're also able to Shift drag this and repeat that operation. So it still is able to support both join and cut when it comes to the transform gizmo. And I felt that there should be no exception with it when it comes to our repeat system as well. When it comes to grid will be a topic for updates to come. If we press Alt W, we can jump over to Boxcutter and activate grid. And currently we are going to be talking about infinite. Infinite, as of our previous updates, was pretty basic. It does the job when it comes to needing a grid. However, this grid begins to fall apart the moment you begin requesting more points. So for example, right now we have a default of 10, which we found to be safe and fast for most computers. If we were to jump this up to 30, we see that the dot for snapping is no longer keeping up with my cursor, meaning that there's now some sort of speed bottleneck occurring. If we were to press D and ensure that we are in box, let's say I want to begin drawing here, we can just see that the grid is just not able to keep up with my motions at 30 on the count. So let's increase this to 100. So now we have 100 points, and that means whenever I hold control, I press control, and then the grid pops up a few seconds later, and we see that the dot is absolutely having no time keeping up with the cursor. And this is where Grid Infinite somewhat failed as a system, and is the reason that Grid Static was born, was to attempt to get past these limitations. But that doesn't mean that we are done with Infinite. It just means that there's work that needs to be done with it, and we are of course wanting to do that work. So here I'm just showing you just how things could possibly get a little bit slow with our previous grid. However, we bring up our newest update where I'm currently using Infinite, and here's what we are looking at whenever we're using 10. However, let's actually jump this up to 30. As you remember, 30 was also falling apart a little bit, and we see that 30 is now working admirably. In case you're wondering why my shape is a wire, you can press H during draw and it will toggle your shape becoming a wire or not, just like I just did, to bring it back solid. And here we are able to work on a 30 count grid without any issue. We see that the cut actually failed, and that's because I was hotlining, meaning I cut precisely onto another edge, causing a Boolean failure to occur. So here we are looking at our segments at 30, but let's increase this to 100. 100 was where things truly hit its pinch point before, and we see that now that is no longer a thing. And this is actually kind of our stage 2 update to the grid, just to improve things with Mac and ensure that things were as stable as possible when it came to Mac OS. However, there's even another level of grid that we aim to go for that'll be showing up in a future update. It could have been in today's, but we wanted to kind of unwrap this thing in stages. So here we see my grid set to 200, and while I can't even see the bounds of the grid until I scale it down, we see that the grid is actually moving on screen quite fast, and we're able to use it and have the dot follow the cursor, and there's no lag behind. So seeing this in action is something that, you know, I found to be truly impressive, and I'm just glad to see that it's finally been accomplished. And now we can say that the grid inside of Boxcutter is as fast as it's supposed to be. However, there's even more speed to be had here. In fact, internal testing shows us that we can actually break it down once we get to something like 300, which is not able to be hit because of the limit that is specified. But normally, if we were able to jump this up any higher than 200, this speed would also begin to break down. But just letting users know that we now are aiming to support even more units than ever. So whenever it comes to performing snapping, you should be able to see a grid all the way to infinity if requested. But also, of course, the bounds is the very foundation of what infinite grid's about, is fading it out to something nice. So users of the grid, you'll definitely be noticing some speed improvements over the next updates coming to Boxcutter, but just letting you know that it's definitely much faster than it was before. So one of the weird things I like to do with grid that wasn't officially supported is that if you were to begin drawing with grid, you are basically snapping to the increments of the grid at the point that you had it that you began drawing. And so I've always wanted to be able to control roll the grid up and also be able to continue snapping to grid even though the scale bounds are now different according to what we just did with control rolling the wheel. But we see that there's an inaccuracy that occurs whenever you begin adjusting how many points is on the grid or the size of it in the middle of your drawing. So this isn't so much a problem, but was definitely a bit of an inconvenience. This is something we also aim to improve in this update. So let's change this back to something like 50 to be reasonable. And we see that now we're able to draw. Actually, let's switch over to Ngon. And so we're drawing our Ngon at this scale, but we're able to roll our wheel and increase the scale, and we see that we're still able to snap the grid. We can actually roll our count back down, get to something really micro, and continue snapping to that. So it just lets you know that now you're able to dynamically adjust your grid during draw, and it will continue to snap to those points. Wedge has always played a major role in Boxcutter, and in this update, Wedge has been expanded. So basically we're drawing a box, but you can always shift it to Wedge whenever you want by just pressing W, and now we can see that we're now drawing using a wedge box. So now every box I draw will have a wedge, and I could also press W or Shift tilde to rotate the shape inside in order to get the wedge to go exactly the direction that I want. So right now you see me using wedge as we've always known it, just drawing a general wedge. However, if we expand the drop down for the shape, we see that there's now a new factor in width. Factor is interesting because you can choose which side of the shape you're going to receive your wedge. So if I change this all the way to 0, we're now actually wedging it in a reverse fashion, which we can still press Shift tilde in order to rotate the shape inside depending on where we want to get our wedge to go. But for reasons unexplained, we have this currently set to 1. Whenever it comes to width, width is also able to be adjusted. So if we press Control D to bring up our behavior helper, we can adjust our width, and we see that by toggling the width, you're able to bring the shape in and adjust the type of wedge you're getting. There's still a very particular type of wedge that I endeavor to get that we still haven't achieved yet, but just wanted to let you know that we are working on expanding wedge to begin taking it forward. So let's press Control D, let's set our width back to 1, and let's actually set our factor to 0.5. And so with this particular setting configuration, we now see that the wedge point is in the middle, allowing us to draw a very different type of wedge than we were able to do in previous versions. In fact, let's lower our auto smooth so it shows up the way we intend, and you can actually see that now we're able to draw wedges that actually begin in the middle, and we can still press B in order to bevel these in the event that we want to bevel the wedge. So there's still a lot of aspects of wedge that I want to examine to a fine point as we continue advancing it forward, but just letting you know that some steps have been taken in this update to bring some of the weld changes that we've been working on behind the scenes finally to the surface so you, the user, can experience it. Whenever I talk about the coveted wedge, I'm talking about this particular wedge right here. We can draw a box, and let's just press W to wedge it. And what we want to do is actually just dissolve that point, and we'll bring this in, bring that out, select these two, and bevel it. So I'm always pondering how we can get this particular wedge inside of Boxcutter, but the rule about not moving top points is something that works against us. So it's something that I'm always contemplating, but maybe the day will come when we'll be able to draw wedges in this particular shape in addition to the shapes that I've shown previously. So everything that we're doing is working towards that in a regard. For a theatric effect, we'll turn off grid in order to use snap dots. So here we are looking at our snap dots. And if we expand the shape drop down, we see that in addition to draw line, wedge, there's also another new option, and that is called grid. By checking grid, we see that there's a variety of options whenever it comes to using grid. The most important one to keep in mind is auto solidify, meaning that if you have this off and your box grid is not auto solidifying, you're going to have some issues with manifold geometry. But having it solidified will give a more predictable result. And then of course you can choose how many divisions shows up in your grid draw. So by holding control, I'm able to use this point as a drop off, and we see that we're now able to draw grids inside of Boxcutter as cutting shapes. And by pressing T, you're able to adjust the thickness. If you press Shift G, you can actually go into a grid modal where you can scroll down the wheel in order to choose how many segments you actually have occurring inside of your grid. And just like that, we have now created a grid shape on this side looking like a cool little button panel. And on the other side, we can do the same thing. We see that once we draw the grid out, it's automatically receiving the solidification. Just to show in action what happens if you do not have auto solidification, we bring out the grid and we see that there is no thickness requiring us to press T. So one of the steps we wanted to do on the way of bringing grid in was to remove the need for users to have to press T. So for that reason, auto solidify is on whenever you use grid in a cutting state. However, in the event that you're doing, like say, a knife cut, you probably want to have auto solidify off so you can use grid as more of a free-form knife tool. Another thing I want to talk about is border. Border is another toggle that can be toggled for grid, and we see that whenever we bring in our grid, it now looks more like a tic-tac-toe board, and there's not actually a border around it. So you can actually toggle that on the fly, I believe, even during the tool usage, like you see me doing here, where I'm able to click border and it just toggles it. We could even get rid of the grid altogether and just be brought back to a red shape with solidification. When it comes to removing modifiers, all you have to do is just press the key twice and you're able to remove it. So I'd press T a second time and it removed it, just like if I were to press B and remove it again pressing B. So there I am, of course, switching my shape back to being a box. But if I wanted to, I could always press Shift G and that will turn it into a grid where I can roll the wheel to choose how many segments I get, and then jump over to T and press T to choose how much thickness I have. So now I've placed this grid shape. And just for follies, let's double click and just perform a couple of repeats just to ensure that repeat is also working with grid as well. And with this, I'm only scratching the surface, but just introducing a new grid shape inside of Boxcutter. In a previous update, we attempted some things to make Weld behave a little bit smarter when it came to its behavior with bevel. So here I am using bevel. The bevels ran all the way to the point of meeting, and I have a bunch of segments in it. And if we press spacebar, we see that it behaves as intended. We do the same thing again. We bevel it all the way to the meeting point, but this time if we add solidify and we press spacebar, we see that things did not work out. And I could tell it didn't work out because I could see the inside of the mesh. But if we were to just keep working, we would just continue to cut holes in our mesh. So let's use ever scroll to bring this back and let's look at what happened. So what happened is that bevel had its weld removed, which caused solidify to create a non-manifold mesh. So if we just add a weld, you can see that even without it in the correct order, the shape then became solid. And by toggling it off and on, we could see how important a weld is to getting this particular maneuver to behave as intended. And to show that again, if we just bring in the shape and we bevel it all the way to the point of junction and we click, it behaves right. But if we bring in a bevel and we bring it to the point of junction, but we add solidify, it does not behave correct. And this is something that, you know, is just unacceptable. We want our cuts to work in as many cases as possible, and there shouldn't be any cases or loopholes where cuts fail because they'll cause manifold issues, which increase user frustration, thus causing me emails, and that's never a good day for anyone. So what we want to do is actually mitigate that particular issue. So for now, in this particular version of Boxcutter 718.5, we actually have that aspect of Boxcutter disabled. So let's just turn off grid and go back to general box, and we press bevel. We bevel to the point of meeting, we press spacebar. So far so good. Let's bevel to the point of meeting, tab, press T, spacebar, everything's fine. We do that again, bevel to the point of meeting, press T, spacebar, it's fine. And I don't even have to check the modifiers on this to ensure that they're fine, because I just know that they are going to be fine in this particular example, because like most examples that I go through, I test them 1,000 times just to make sure that these bugs are truly gone, because nothing's worse than expressing that a bug has been removed to only see that that bug rears its ugly head once again, causing us to have to reopen a support ticket for an issue that was supposed to have already been solved. So here we are bringing in our shape, pressing T, spacebar, and everything's fine. This shape is completely manifold, and if we were to shift click ever scroll to go into modifier scroll, we could press shift spacebar and just let all these play back, roll down the time so the interval is even shorter, and we see that everything is behaving as intended. So to conclude this video, I just want to show a quick little shape I've been working on kind of as a test study. I'm always searching for, you know, the perfect shape to use to introduce new users to Boxcutter and HardOps. And so this is just one of those shapes. You know, sometimes I'll get up in the morning and just goof off with the idea of, you know, just messing with the shape and seeing where it goes. So the key thing about this particular shape is grabbing this particular bevel and just rounding it out using bevel, which just feels very nice. And then, you know, grabbing this piece, breaking that with the bevel, breaking that one with the bevel. And we could also take this and SX scale it. And from here we can get to work. So one of my favorite tools in HardOps to mess with occasionally is selection of boolean. It's also located under ST mesh tools, but it's also located under booleans. You can just choose selection of boolean. This will allow you to inset, and then from there click to perform the extrude, and now we've performed an extrusion to mesh. In fact, in the back of my head, I'm pondering why it jumped into edit mode. I'll be checking into that later. I mean, anytime I'm testing these tools, I'm always pondering what the next level is and what further tasks need to be done for it. So now I'm actually using Ngon in line mode in order to perform a series of cuts just across, nothing major. And of course we want to Alt-X mirror this to the other side using a modifier. In the event that you bring up mirror and it's not normal, you can just press X and it'll reset mirror to default settings. So always bring up mirror, just use the default settings, and I'm good to go. However, before we continue, we want to probably add a little bit more to this. So I'm just going to Control B, bevel these. Even though beveling it put a sharp edge on both sides of it, I can just Control Shift click sharpen to perform a resharp, and that will actually solve that particular issue. So let's just alt click sharpen, and we're ready to continue on to the next level. So at this point, I like to perform a slice on the side and begin experimenting with my wedges. I mean, in this case, we can't get it to conform all the way to the surface, all the way across this because we beveled it, but it's fine for me to shift to live and just kind of eyeball this particular wedge. As long as the wedge isn't too big, it shouldn't look too inaccurate. And we just want to continue on. Same thing here. Just looking at it from the side, we could rotate it, but I see that my rotation axis is off. So instead of dealing with that, we'll just shift it to live. So shift to live is like my favorite fallback. I refer to it as the fallback of fallbacks. Another thing I also like to try with these boxes now is I'll draw a shape similar to what you're seeing, and I'll use knife to try to knife it, and then by exiting Boxcutter, I can select this face, control click all the way to here. We could extrude it straight up and then press SX0, and we will actually, well, let's not use that. Let's just not. I just had memories of a previous session where it actually merged too much geometry, giving me an oblong shape. So we'll actually just bring it into meat like so, dissolving one edge because I know there's a double there, but these two aren't worth being merged, and I'm pretty sure auto merge would actually finish the job. So because of the way that this shape's made, we can actually grab this edge and bevel it, and everything of course is connected, so everything's above board there, and this is really what our shape is so far. So, and this is actually the beginning of the exercise. Like, now that you've made this shape, you can now begin experimenting with the different types of detail you would add. So for me, I would of course perform a cut here, give it a very thin bevel of few segments so that way it fits this area. I'm alt grabbing this draw dot in order to keep the proportions. So now that we have that, we can of course follow that piece with another good piece. I wanted to end this video with the demo. I haven't done a demo in the last couple of videos, and it's always a fun time. And we see that we're now beginning to compromise our surface a little bit. So for that, I'll actually tab into edit mode and just mitigate it to be to a more central area. And we could even take drastic measures like you see me doing here, where I'm putting an edge loop all the way across and then connecting them with J using a lightning bolt, as you see here. GX, bring a point here, select both of these, J, grab both of these, GX, in order to bring them in, and we've kind of mitigated this area. So my goal with modeling is always to try to mitigate shading as it happens, to just try to get to the end goal. But now that we have this, we can actually begin really having fun. So I'm alt scrolling back to Ngon line, and I just, for some reason, it wasn't looking completely head on. I was off there. But now that we have Ngon line, we can just begin drawing. And of course, after we set our last point, we want to press T and lower the thickness, because having such thick Ngon lines is going to not work out for us. But now that we have this, we can just begin just cutting panels into it. And this is one of the funner parts of this exercise. Just notice how at the beginning I'm selecting in between. So basically I'm activating view align, because you can see the word view is in red, meaning that because of my first click, the selection was overridden because there was no surface underneath. Instead it located view. So I'm basically starting in between to activate view as like a sort of hack, where I can then go through and get these lines. And it's not even a hack, it's just all the systems working the way they're supposed to. In fact, I'm so obsessed with everything working the way it's supposed to that, sometimes issues with just a single OS like Mac will kind of pause our plans going forward on everything until it's rectified. So while I, don't care about Mac and the way that I describe it, I do actually care that our product performs in it the way it's supposed to, because Mac people want a Mac, and Mac people also want an infinite grid. I told so many people who wrote me with Mac issues that they should use static grid, and they're like, no, I want to use infinite because I love infinite. It's like, huh. Alright, well that is good to know. It's good to know that people love infinite, especially in the face of a new grid being presented in front of them. And that sort of loyalty just lets us know to continue putting our efforts into making these things work the way as functionally intended, because there are people who like one particular feature over the other. So now that we've paneled this out real quick, we could do all sorts of stuff. I could use Everscroll, and we could actually just bring everything back while pressing A. And someday we might have to bring in like a filtration system for what cutters we could bring back. Anytime I experience something that's like a bunch of clicks, all I could think about is how it could be automated to be improved. But I'll spare you guys that. So I'm just going to jump to collection 2, select this, have an active selection, and we could press Q and solidify and adjust the solidify of everything at the same time. If we wanted just to make it even thinner, which is what I'm wanting to do in my case. And we also can continue putting loops in between. And let's just make these continuous as well, because the point that it needs to connect to is so close, so why not help it make its connection? So now here we are looking at this particular slet shape, and usually I'll just continue jumping back and forth as far as modifying things on this, adding cuts, lowering the auto smooth, until I get to that desired final result. And there's all sorts of little fun deviations I see that can be done in this particular exercise. Like Wedge is just one of those edge detailers. An edge can be so boring, but with Wedge you can just quickly have a break in the surface that you can come back and grab later and bevel to really make look exquisite. Another trick that I really love with Wedge that I didn't get the chance to showcase is right here. So let's select this, and we are just, or let's select this, and let's see how much meat we got in here. We got a little bit of meat, and let's just press W to wedge, and we'll just wedge it just right, like so. And from here we can now draw a box on top, cut straight down, press B to bevel, round it out, and there we go. So these little numbers right here are just some of the shapes I've been playing with lately, just seeing how far I can get with them. I'll pause this circle, grab it, reverse bevel the top face using HardOps just real fast to just level that out. But these shapes are always fun to try to fit in places. Another thing with Wedge is Wedge has really helped me connect with intersect. Intersect is probably our least used Boolean operation inside of HardOps, but inside of Boxcutter it's definitely getting some play. So here I am performing a wedge on this particular area. However, we see that this isn't going to work out. So first thing I'm going to do is trim it down to size. Next thing I'm going to do is jump over to N-gon, and we're going to click in between space and time to begin drawing our N-gon. And we'll just bring that across, and we'll press XX to change it over to intersect. And by pressing spacebar, we've now limited the wedge to this particular area. And we can even bring back our cutter with Everscroll and just move it ever so slightly to ensure that we're actually wedging this in an adequate fashion. In fact, I may even want to raise it up a little bit just to make sure that it transitions with the surface right. And just like that, we're able to use wedge to our advantage. So, most of the time I'm actually still using wedge in its default state, this one. But there are some cases where having your factor at 0.5 could be beneficial to you. So here I am drawing my wedge, and I'm basically able to double wedge these connecting pieces at the same time, which is just one of those things that I never thought of until recently. But it's like, wow, double wedging, it is the bee's knees. So I'm hoping that users are able to enjoy this sort of stuff. Of course, anytime you want to disable the states on your shapes, you can just do that through this panel. So, you're never locked into anything. You can even toggle this stuff off during the tool. If you think like me, or if you think about it in terms of how I would want it, you know, I want that flexibility of being able to make a decision, to change the decision, to reverse the decision, even in the middle of the tool. There's still some things that I was actually wanting to bring to this update, like the ability to roll modifiers up to stack in Boxcutter and also things like that. But we'll have to save that for next time. But there's always more to be done to further refine this. I mean, there's still systems that need to be added to connect with geometry nodes and things like that. So our work is cut out for us. But just like that, we're able to create this quick shape, and I was able to do it in less than 12 minutes. In fact, if I wanted to continue taking this on to the next level, another trick that I like is shift-clicking Smart Apply, which will Smart Apply a duplicate and select it. So I'll just sharpen that in order to mark all the edges. And we'll jump into face mode, and because I have face selection, or because I'm marking with seams, I can just isolate by faces, and we'll just use this piece and press I and test my patience. Let's just control I and delete everything else, and by test my patience, I mean just letting that loop live. I was looking at it and thinking, that's not going to inset right, and sure enough it didn't. It was a disappointment. So let's just delete that loop, and here we are looking at it. And we can dissolve that as well, because that's also going to be problematic. And let's just take this, solidify it, but press 2 to push it out both directions, and we can just perform a difference. And now we're adding transitions in here to the various surfaces, and we can do that to a bigger piece like this piece here. It's also worth just shift clicking Smart Apply to get a clone and then marking it as hard as possible. And we see that some edges are being missed here. Alright, that looks about correct. So let's just press I. We'll inset it ever so slightly to the limit. Press Control I, delete all the rest of the geometry as fast as possible before you get confused on what's going on here. And let's just select this edge, dissolve it, because that wasn't going to work out. And if it happened on that side, it's going to happen on the other side. But it looks like it's fine, so let's just double check, take a quick perimeter scan, and we'll press Q, go under modifier, solidify, give it quite a bit of thickness, maybe not so much thickness if we can see overlap, but you know, let's keep things within the limits. And there we are performing a difference boolean with that. So we could press D, switch back over to Boxcutter. And notice that I jump from wedge box to box just by selecting box in a menu. I love that. It's the small things that I love the most. You know, it's all behavioral to me. And let's actually begin drawing on this side. And we'll just bring that across. And we could draw a box. We'll just perform a box extrusion, but we'll press W to make it a wedge. And now that it's a wedge, we can just work it. You know, work it just a little bit. Just put a little tick in here, put a little tick there, put a little tick everywhere. Like, I'm determined to perform 20,000 wedges and find out where a wedge is truly supposed to go. I feel that there are just areas that are untapped that could be wedged that are yet to be discovered. So I am on that quest. So now we basically have our sled complete. However, I also like to get a little weird with it. And by weird, I mean I will draw a little box. We'll turn off snapping, and we will just control double click, and repeat is so good now. You know, the complaints that I have left for it are minimal, which means that we get to go back to the process of taking repeat forward. But repeat has had such a long road, and I'm eternally proud of the work that Proxy and Loof have put into all these versions of Boxcutter, because you know, every single fix registers to me. It completely changes my experience, making things even smoother and faster. And the further we go, the more minor these changes will be, as far as systems changing and user interface and muscle memory being adjusted, and it'll all just be systematic. And I feel like that's a good place to be. I mean, of course, we want to try allowing users to be able to adjust the tool however they want, to whatever level they want, but first we got to get those systems in place where they're predictable, reliable, and also stable. So while things are a little crazy in this Blender 3.0 right now, I am a bit of a sadist when it comes to Blender. I'll use Blender even if it was crashing on a 5-minute timer. I would just work within the bounds that I'm given. But as you see in this video, I was able to get pretty far using Blender 3.0 without any sort of crashes. So, you know, it always will make a fool of me, Blender. I mean, if there's some sort of issue that I'm counting on to happen, you know, it might not happen. It might just surprise you by remaining stable. But there are still some random crashes that will occur. So if you're using 3.0, I definitely recommend also keeping a LTS handy just in case, because you know there are some issues that were coming up. I think I'm already experiencing some files that I can no longer open in this version. Just minor things, but you know I always roll with the punches because I feel like using the most up-to-date version of Blender shows me possible future issues that could happen with customers, and that's something that I care about. So now I want to orient a box to this. This is where our buddy Shift V and changing to nearest edge using our orientation comes in handy. I am speechless when it comes to talking about orientation. Now that the quest has been fulfilled, we are now seeing just things the way that they're supposed to be as far as behavior. You know, previously we had dots that weren't adhering to our behavior panel, we had grids that were not adhering, and slowly, bunny by bunny, we have leveled it up to the point that we're now ready to take on ogres. So I just cannot express enough gratitude for Loof and Proxy for their tireless work, and also AR. There are some things that we have cooking in the background that will probably not be coming out for a while, but definitely will be pretty impressive when they are. You know, we're always thinking of what's the next shape for Boxcutter, what's the next step to take forward, and brought to you by PowerSave. I'm going to go ahead and save this as QBox, and we see that I'm now on QBox number 427 of the QBox line, powered by PowerSave. But with that, I'll wrap up this video. I'm getting reflective, but all in all, just wanted to ensure and show you guys that the latest update is out and it's fine, and just wanted to show a little bit of an action. And with that, I will wrap up this video. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you next time.